A couple of things. I mentioned 2 books on Shakespeare and comedy last time. One is by Northrop Frye called A Natural Perspective, and that's Barber. C.L. Barber, Shakespeare's Festive Comedy, and they're 2 of the best general books on Shakespeare and comedy. They won't be on the final. I'm just, in case any of you want to explore some of this material a little further, I'm going to occasionally give you references like that. We'll get to Ovid in a minute. Okay, as I've been saying, Romeo and Juliet and Midsummer Night's Dream as a pair give us a great chance to see the differences between comedy and tragedy. And since this is a government department course, we finally have a matrix to look at. And I arrived at it by regression analysis. In literary studies, regression analysis is when you read the plays backwards. What I've done here is to plot tragedy and comedy against their respective virtues and vices. And we've seen all this, but I'm just trying to formulate it for you now. In tragedy, the great virtue is integrity, sticking to your principles. And the tragic hero or heroine is the character who will die rather than sacrifice the principle by which he or she lives. So in a tragedy, honor is more important than life. And we see that in Romeo and Juliet. Their love is absolute. They will sacrifice anything to it. They will sacrifice family. They will sacrifice their community, the ordinary life. They show their tragic by their willingness to die for what they stand for. And what the tragic hero despises is pliancy. Is someone without backbone, someone who won't stand up for what he or she believes in. Famously in Sophocles' Antigone, Antigone has contempt for her sister Ismene, because Ismene won't, like Antigone, stand up to the city and wants to give in for the sake of prudence in order to survive. Now, correspondingly in comedy, the great virtue is flexibility. It's being willing to go with the flow, of not letting your principles stand in the way of a happy outcome. So typically the comic figure believes in life over honor or life over principle. We saw this in the contrast between Hotspur and Falstaff. The comic figure keeps changing until things get right. Many people have spoken about the pattern of A Midsummer Night's Dream being that of a dance, in which the lovers keep changing partners until the music stops, and then that's it. And you put up with what you're left with. So that at the beginning, Hermia and Helena and Lysander and Demetrius are at odds, and they can't quite pair up. But by shifting things around enough, they get so confused that it doesn't matter to them so much anymore who they're paired up with, as the fact that they are paired up and everybody can live happily ever after. This means that in comedy, there has to be a lot of flexibility, a willingness to change and adapt. And that's why Metamorphosis is a central image in Midsummer Night's Dream. It does seem that Ovid was Shakespeare's favorite poet, and that Ovid's book, The Metamorphoses, was his favorite book. He probably knew it in Latin. There was an Elizabethan translation in English by a man named Arthur Golding, which Shakespeare often uses. You can see him, in effect, quote from it in The Tempest, for example. And so Midsummer Night's Dream is a tremendously Ovidian play. Ovid's Metamorphoses tells all those tales of how Jupiter would change into a swan in order to mate with Leda, and all these stories of gods transforming into human beings transform into gods, human beings transforming into trees, as in the story of Apollo and Daphne. There are all sorts of reflections of that in this play. Lots of Ovidian transformations in it. And it reflects Shakespeare's sense that comedy is a world of transformation. And that means of adaptation, in which the characters have to keep transforming in order to adapt. They have to fit themselves to the world they're in. And so at the end of this play, the lovers are paired off. You don't even notice that Demetrius is in a drug-induced love for Helena. It's true he once loved her, but the only reason he loves her at the end of this play is because of the love juice that Oberon put on his eyes. But that's okay. Again, the main thing in this play and in comedy in general is that there should be happiness at the end. So the great vice in comedy is obstinacy or stubbornness, your unwillingness to bend, and above all, comedy is a world of substitution, which denies the uniqueness of individuals. In tragedy, the choice would be Hermia or death. In comedy, the choice is Hermia or Helena. That is, you see this with Romeo and Juliet. That is truly a love of accept no substitutes. In fact, Shakespeare sets it up so we can see this movement. When Romeo moves from Rosalind to Juliet, that looks comic to people. Oh, you were so in love with Rosalind, what happened here? Now you're in love with Juliet, and people think the love for Juliet can't be deep if it's changeable. And so the whole thing that Romeo and Juliet have to prove is this time's for real. This time is forever. And that means this time's for death. That's the best way to prove that this is their one and only love, if they die for each other. And it's one reason why these kind of lovers are so tempted to die for each other, to make sure it's a one-time big event. But comedy is the world where you do accept substitutes, where you realize that having a good wife or having a good husband is better than having the perfect man or the perfect woman, that maybe the perfect man or woman is not obtainable or available. Comic figures are willing to settle for something less than the absolute. Tragic figures are not. So again, the rule of comedy is, yes, accept substitutes. Interchangeability. Again, tragedy deals with the unique character. There's only Romeo, there's only one Juliet. But as I told you, once you have a Hermia and a Helena and a Lysander and Demetrius, there are substitutes available. You can change things, you can permute things, you can try a different combination. You keep trying until it works out and everybody's paired off and everybody can be happily married and nobody has to die. If you won't accept substitutes, you have to die. If you will accept substitutes, you can live on. And, I'm trying to suggest that Shakespeare sees both these visions of life as valid. It's one reason I think he is perhaps the only person who ever wrote comedy and tragedy so successfully. He's able to appreciate the tragic hero and heroine. He's also able to appreciate why some people might not want to die and why they might want to have long lives and prosper, as Mr. Spock used to tell us to do. Another aspect of this is in terms of the relation to the community. Tragedy is an exclusive form and comedy is an inclusive form. That is, in tragedy, it turns out that the community cannot reform at the end with all the people still there. That in Romeo and Juliet, there are at least two characters, Romeo and Juliet, who will not compromise their vision to re-enter the city. They would rather die than sacrifice their principles. They would not accept a proposal. Okay, you can be happily members of Verona again, except you're going to have to give up your love because one of you is a Montague and one of you is a Capulet. Tragedy offers us unique individuals who have some kind of vision, that transcends that of the ordinary community and who die to maintain the integrity of that vision. It means there's a sense of diminishment at the end of tragedy. The community has survived, it's reintegrated, and yet only at a sacrifice, and it often seems the sacrifice of the most interesting or noble figures in the community. We'll see a very strong example of that at the end of King Lear. Comedy is an inclusive vision. It aims at bringing everybody back together at the end. And generally, comedy ends with a kind of reintegrating celebration. Very often some kind of dance, as we can see in the Bergamask of the actors in A Midsummer Night's Dream. If you turn to the end of Midsummer Night's Dream, which is page 85, so Act 5, Scene 1, about line 405, Oberon appears and blesses the company, and it's a married company or soon about to be a married company. Line 404, Act 5, Scene 1, through this house each fairy stray, to the best bride bed will we, which by us shall blessed be, and the issue there create ever shall be fortunate, so shall all the couples three ever true and loving be, and the blots of nature's hand shall not in their issue stand. So there is the emphasis at the end of the play. It's on marriage, it's on children, it's on long life and prospering. It's difficult to believe that this play was not written for some kind of wedding. That some court wedding, some aristocratic wedding. There's no proof of this, but many people have speculated this. What a great thing this would have performed at your wedding as a celebration. And there you see the way Shakespeare's comedies end. With a marriage, with a promise of family and of long life. And everybody is included in the final tableau. We'll see some variants of this in As You Like It and Twelfth Night, but basically the overall direction of comedy is to reintegrate the whole community. But to do that, the characters must compromise. They must give up whatever aspect of their vision showed them something beyond the city. And that's why these characters in Midsummer Night's Dream, they wanted the world of night, they wanted the world of dreams, they wanted that world of Eros, and they got it. But when they saw it, it was a little too much for them. It was too confusing, too disturbing, too violent. And Demetrius and Lysander were at each other's throats. Hermia and Helena were fighting. And there's a sense they just can't bear it. They want to get back into the city. That's why they, unlike Romeo and Juliet, start wishing for the coming of day. Remember when Romeo and Juliet were wed and spent a night together, they wanted that night to last forever, even to the point where they were willing to deny its daytime when daytime came. These characters in this play, because this is a comedy, they want to get back to the daytime. The night's been a little too much for them, a little too dreamlike and therefore nightmarish, the world they got into. So they will reintegrate into the community at the end. Think of Nick Bottom. Nick Bottom has had a most rare vision, he says, and daringly Shakespeare compares it to 1 Corinthians. Takes something out of the New Testament, the equivalent of seeing some kind of divine revelation, and then Nick Bottom comes back with this revelation and he can't talk about it because he thinks his friends will laugh at him. And he actually says, if I tell you, I'll be no true Athenian. And that's profoundly true. That if he clings to that vision, that he had a romance with a fairy queen, he can never reintegrate into Athens because Athens will just laugh at that. It's beyond Athens' realm of experience. So he has to give up that vision. And indeed, it's a wonderful vision, but it was also deeply disturbing to him and would keep him out of the community. And somehow he knows to get back into the community, he must renounce that vision. And we have to imagine, 30 years from now, a Nick Bottom in a pub in Athens saying, "You're not going to believe this. but me and Titania, the queen of the fairies, we had this little fling, you know. And everyone says, sure, Nick, we've heard that story many times. You and the queen of the fairies, sure. So there's something reconciling about the end of a comedy. It does allow life to go on, but at some kind of lower level. What we see now, all of this is related to politics. I'm trying to give you some sense of how these very forms, comedy and tragedy, are related to politics because they define different kinds of community. But in all cases, the refounding of the city is based on a kind of acceptance of mediocrity. In tragedy, the most extraordinary individuals must be rejected. They're in a sense expelled by the community. They are kind of tragic sacrifices to the reintegration of the community, as happens in Romeo and Juliet. And in comedy, everybody just has to settle on something more ordinary. So that's the sense in which tragedy deals with the extraordinary element in human life, comedy with the ordinary element, tragedy with the exceptional element, comedy with the average element. And again, it seems to be remarkable. Shakespeare had an appreciation for both these aspects of human life. Most dramatists lean in one direction or the other. Now, one way Shakespeare creates this comedy tragedy shift is by the degree of identification we have with the action. In tragedy, Shakespeare really works to get us to identify with the characters and to see events from their perspective. And for that purpose, he always gives great poetry to his tragic figures, so that Romeo is, oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright, or what light through yonder window breaks, it is the east, and Juliet is the sun. This kind of poetry just sweeps us into the action, and we're compelled to follow it. There's deep identification with the tragic figures in Shakespeare. To achieve comic effects, Shakespeare works for detachment. He wants us to view the characters with a certain degree of emotional distance and detachment. You can say in tragedy, we look up to the characters. In comedy, we look down on the characters. That's something that Aristotle says in the Poetics, when he says that tragedy shows figures better than we are, and comedy shows figures worse than we are. And again, if we had the second book of Aristotle's Poetics, we might know more about what he meant by this. But in Midsummer Night's Dream in particular, Shakespeare creates the detachment by having a number of detached observers within the play. Here he really exploits this structure of overplot, plot, and underplot that I've been talking about. There are a number of characters in this play who literally and metaphorically look down on the other characters. We see this with Theseus in the last act, looking at the rude mechanicals, and above all, the fairies have this remote perspective on humanity. They take us somewhat seriously, but not all that seriously. And so on page 45, maybe the most famous line in the play, this is Act 3, Scene 2, about line 115. Puck says, "Lord, what fools these mortals be." And the whole fairy plot is there to give us this distant perspective on human life and to see how, from some perspective, it's ridiculous. Now, again, part of it is that Shakespeare doesn't give the young lovers in this play the level of poetry he gives to Romeo and Juliet. Again, by doubling the action, he makes it look a little absurd to us. And in general, there are all these factors in the play which make us, take the characters seriously, because we have to if we're going to stay and watch the play. But we always have a superior perspective. We're often seeing them not through their own eyes, but through the eyes of Oberon and Titania and Puck, or through the eyes of Theseus and Hippolyta. And now again, these are not absolutes. There's always some degree of detachment in our viewing a Shakespeare play. There's some degree of identification, but comedy emphasizes the element of detachment, and tragedy emphasizes the element of identification. So again, we'll keep coming back to this as we do a couple more comedies, but I think I offer you this scheme. I think it will help you formulate the difference between the two genres. Now, let me move on to the overplot, which I haven't said too much about. And in a way, the underplot. It's really a brilliant effect of this play is having Nick Bottom and Duke Theseus in it. In a way, you couldn't have a greater contrast. The Duke of Athens at the top of the hierarchy and Nick Bottom right there at the bottom. Yet, I think if the fairies had changed babies at birth, we might have ended up with a Duke Bottom and a Nick Theseus the Weaver. That is, in some ways, the play shows us how different these characters are. In other ways, as we've seen, Bottom's a petty tyrant. That's the kind of part he'd like to play. He is the guy that is the #1 actor in this little theater troupe. They themselves say they can't do without him when he's gone missing, can't stage the play without him. When the Queen of the Fairies falls in love with him, Bottom is perfectly prepared to exploit the situation, ends up acting like a Oriental potentate with mustard and pea blossom and all these other fairies. He can respond to that part, and there's a sense as if he's got the same soul as Theseus. It's just that he was born a weaver and Theseus was born a duke. And I think here, typically, as in Shakespeare, as we saw in Henry IV, Part 1, he'll create contrast between the great aristocrats in the world and the common people, but also suggest, as he does in Henry IV, Part 1, that these great nobles are no better in certain respects than these highwaymen, these thieves in England. So typically he will set up a hierarchy and also subvert it. And it does raise interesting questions about Theseus that I want to explore. There's not that much about Theseus in the play, but he is the most famous figure in it. He claims to be a rationalist. He claims to speak for order, to bring order to Athens. He has contempt for the irrationality of lovers and of poets, as we'll see. And he comes out, thinking he's in charge of everything, even in charge of love. That is, that he could order Hermia to love Demetrius and not Lysander, because that's what her father says. I'm going to argue that he's too confident that Eros is under his power. And indeed, as we'll see, the whole world of the fairies suggests that Theseus shares power with Oberon. That he's not as completely in control of Athens as he thinks. You might even say that Theseus rules during the day, but Oberon rules during the night. The night's the realm of Eros, and that's when the fairies come out and become in charge of human affairs. But Theseus's neglect of the power of Eros, or his overconfidence about it, is evident in his own family situation. If you look at page 3, so the very opening of the play, Act 1, Scene 1, Line 1, he too is in the grip of Eros. Now, fair Hippolyta, our nuptial hour draws on apace. 4 happy days bring in another moon, but oh, methinks how slow this old womb wanes. She lingers my desires. This guy's got erotic desires of his own, and he's anxious to be able to get in bed with Hippolyta. And notice he says, like to a stepdam or dowager long withering out a young man's revenue. Here he identifies with an impatient young man. Indeed, from the beginning of the play, we see, as so often in Shakespeare, the authorities are associated with the old, The young are associated with Eros, and Hippolyta assures him that, things are going pretty fast here. And so line 12 at the bottom of page 3 says, "Stir up the Athenian youth to merriments. Awake the pert, nimble spirit of youth, turn melancholy forth to funerals." This is where he calls for carnival. And again, C.L. Barber's book is really excellent on that aspect of this play and Shakespearean comedy in general. So he understands that Eros is connected with youth, and that it's the release of energies, and he ought to support that. And then top of page 4, so now still Act 1, Scene 1, line 16, he says, "Hippolyta, I wooed thee with my sword, and won thy love doing the injuries. But I will wed thee in another key, with pomp, with triumph, and with reveling." And there's a slight ominous note there, that he wooed her with his sword and won her love doing her injuries. Now, Hippolyta is an Amazon. And one might have some doubts about marrying an Amazon. Especially in the world of Greek mythology. As some of you may know, one of the sequences on the frieze of the Parthenon is the Greeks and Theseus battling the Amazons. It's a motif that you find a great deal in ancient Greek art, and it represents, as it does very clearly on the Parthenon frieze, the triumph of civilization over barbarism, which for the Greeks means in part the triumph of men over women, and in particular reason over the passions. Is one of these greats. The Amazons were a symbol of a force destructive to hierarchy, these very powerful warlike women. And we get the sense that Theseus is trying to subdue something here. By marrying an Amazon, he is bringing within the city of Athens a force that was normally thought to be outside the city, the kind of force that Athens needed to triumph over. Now, if he could successfully marry her, he would indeed have triumphed over and have subdued the barbarian, which is such a great motif in Greek mythology. But there is a faint suggestion here at the beginning that this will involve a struggle. And then later on page 20, we learn more of the background. This is Act 2, Scene 1, line 70. In the middle of the argument between Oberon and Titania over this Indian boy, Titania says, "But that forsooth the bouncing Amazon, your buskin mistress, and your warrior love to Theseus must be wedded, and you come to give their bed joy and prosperity." So she's claiming that Oberon is sponsoring the Amazon, your buskin mistress and your warrior love, even suggesting that maybe Oberon has been flirting with Hippolyta. And Oberon comes back, "How canst thou thus for shame, Titania, glance at my credit with Hippolyta, knowing I know thy love to Theseus?" So there's a little something suspect here. Has Titania had a fling with Theseus? Has Oberon had a fling with Hippolyta? And even discounting that, line 77, Oberon accuses Titania, "Didst not thou lead him through the glimmering night from Perigenia, whom he ravished, and make him with fair Egles break his faith with Ariadne and Antiope?" So we're reminded that Theseus had some legendary love affairs and an awful lot of the old love him and leave him motifs, where behind him is this string of young women he loved and abandoned. Now, Shakespeare does not highlight this, obviously, but it's interesting that this is there, that it impeaches Theseus's claims simply to stand for rationality and the control of Eros, that he has a rather checkered past when it comes to the issue, that he in fact is a rapist. He's ravished women. And that has led some people, including me, to wonder about this marriage between Theseus and Hippolyta, because the son of this marriage is a young man named Hippolytus. And Hippolytus is the subject of a Greek tragedy by Euripides and also of a Latin tragedy by Seneca named Hippolytus. This is the story of Phaedra and Hippolytus. I don't want to overstress this point because surely Shakespeare does not stress it. But there's a hint of a kind of tragedy lingering in the background of this story. This super confident Theseus, who thinks he's in control of Eros, is going to marry this Amazon, and the product of it is going to be Hippolytus. Now, Hippolyta dies. Theseus remarries a woman named Phaedra. And Hippolytus, in both Euripides and Seneca and in Greek mythology in general, scorns women. He worships Artemis, the goddess of the moon, the goddess of chastity. And Phaedra falls in love with him. And I won't go through all the details, but basically it ends very tragically with Phaedra rejected by Hippolytus. She accuses him of having tried to rape her. Theseus hears that, prays to Neptune. Neptune effectively kills Hippolytus, and then Phaedra kills herself. Not exactly your basic comic material there. And it's a bit odd that Shakespeare should surround this comic story of the young lovers with one of the great tragedies, because again, this is a story that Euripides wrote about. Seneca was later picked up by Racine, French neoclassical tragedy. It's been come back to many, many times, the tragedy of Phaedra. And it's particularly a tragedy of a young man who denies the power of Eros and is effectively punished by the gods from that. Now, again, I don't want to make too much of this. This is a comedy, a very wonderful and in some ways a very light and frothy comedy, and we should be laughing at it. But it's odd that Shakespeare builds into it the story of Theseus, which this very act of marriage, this act of supposedly subduing passion to rationality, had such tragic consequences down the line. And as people have pointed out, this is, well, it's controversial, but there do seem to be some echoes of the Seneca play in this play. I'll talk about one in a minute, but it does appear as if Shakespeare may be quoting from Seneca's Oedipus and from his Hippolytus in the play, maybe trying to call our attention to it. So even setting this aside, because again, I wouldn't want to put too much emphasis on this, there is a sense in the play that Theseus is self-deluded about his power, because he claims to rule this world and to rule the world of Eros, and he doesn't, because he doesn't rule the night, and he shares power with Oberon and Titania. And there are some nice hints of this in the play, I think, that Shakespeare tries to show Theseus bring the play to a conclusion and fail twice. The first one maybe is a little bit much on my part, but if you turn to page 66, so Act 4, Scene 1, line 186, this is the lovers have admitted they want to go back to Athens. They're all paired up properly. And he says, line 185, Act 4, Scene 1, and for the morning now is something worn. Our purpose hunting shall be set aside. Away with us to Athens, 3 and 3. We'll hold a feast in great solemnity. Curtain. It could end there. The lovers have been properly prepared, lined up. There's a nice rhyme there, talk about a feast, but the play goes on. Now, if you turn to page 84, you'll see why I think there's a pattern here. So this is Act 5, Scene 1, about line 370. Again, we've now seen the play. To be honest, all the good stuff in Midsummer Night's Dream is over. So now page 84, Act 5, Scene 1, line 37. Sweet friends, to bed. A fortnight hold we this solemnity. In nightly revels with new jollity. And again, there it is. Big rhyme. By the way, the word solemnity in both passages. He wants to bring the play to a close. Typically in Shakespeare, not always, but typically the most powerful character left standing at the end of the play ends it, and often with some nice concluding rhyme like this. But then out pops Puck and takes the stage from Theseus. And I think this is emblematic of the role of the fairies in the play, that the humans aren't fully in charge, that the fairies share power and maybe even more powerful. And notice here they have invaded Theseus's palace. For much of the play, you could say the world is neatly divided. Theseus rules the day, the fairies rule the night. Theseus rules Athens, the fairies rule the forest, so on. But I think it's quite symbolic and significant that in this final moment, the fairies invade the palace. Now it's for a good purpose, to give this blessing on the marriages. But again, it suggests that you can't keep these good fairies down. They're very powerful. So now let me talk about the role of the fairies in the play. And this is going to be highly speculative, even more speculative than usual for me. I've been thinking about this a long time, and just a couple of weeks ago, I think I finally figured out what the fairies are doing in the play. And let me say, this is going to be in the context of trying to take Shakespeare seriously as a philosopher. I think we've seen he's a political thinker. That is unquestionable. He's someone who thinks profoundly about politics. Whether he's a philosopher, it's a matter of semantics, and we could argue about whether the title applies to him, but I'm going to make perhaps my strongest argument today for Shakespeare as a philosopher. And by that I mean I'm going to try to show you he has an understanding of nature, and that he understands politics within the larger context of an understanding of nature. That would make him a philosopher, particularly in the line of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And we'll be pursuing this in As You Like It, and again in King Lear, the question whether Shakespeare has an understanding of nature, not just the natures of human beings, not just the nature of politics, but the understanding what we would call the world of nature. And that's where I think the fairies do come in here. And my insight, finally, after puzzling about this for years, was that Oberon and Titania are Zeus and Hera. They're Jupiter and Juno. They are awfully similar to the world of pagan mythology. And I'm going to try to argue that this play is a comic effort to revive pagan mythology. Now let me say something first about fairies. Shakespeare in this play began a process which Walt Disney completed, which turned fairies into cute little beings like Tinkerbell. That is, we picture some tiny little creature with wings flitting around and nothing to be afraid of. Now, this is not the way fairies were thought of even in Shakespeare's day, and certainly not in the centuries preceding it. Again, the word has developed connotations that suggest we're dealing with very diminutive, weak beings. As I mentioned before, Edmund Spenser wrote an epic poem called The Fairy Queen, in which the Fairy Queen was an allegory for Queen Elizabeth. And if fairy meant then what it means now, that would not have been much of a tribute to Queen Elizabeth. As the Fairy Queen actually is coming out in the 1580s and 90s. As recently as that, Edmund Spenser was using the old meaning of fairy, which was a very powerful supernatural being. Think more like Tolkien's elves. Fairies were supposed to be immortal, sometimes even evil. Sometimes they take the form of trolls or goblins. Remember, Puck is called Hobgoblin in the play. Fairies were supernatural creatures that were not totally well disposed to human beings. So, for example, people often spoke euphemistically of them and called them the good folk. hoping they weren't as evil as they seemed to be. This is like the Furies being called the Eumenides, the well-disposed ones at the end of Aeschylus's Oresteia. People were afraid of fairies. They were these nighttime forces that could kill you when you traveled, or put spells on you and ruin your crops and ruin your children and steal your children. People were afraid of fairies. Now, I think one thing Shakespeare is doing in this play is kind of demilitarizing fairies. He's trying to turn them into something less frightening and ominous, and in that he succeeded. Now, he's not the only person to have done this, but, and again, as I say, Walt Disney had a great deal of a role in this, but you start to see it in the 19th century in Victorian Britain, the kind of prettification of fairies. But I do want you to understand that this word fairy had very different connotations in Shakespeare's day. So I believe this is an attempt to portray the forces of nature and to offer a kind of alternate theology, or let's say a pagan theology here. And let me try to describe what view of nature emerges in this play. And it's actually a pretty plausible view of nature. Let me contrast it with Orthodox Christian theology to make the point. In the Christian understanding of nature, it's subordinate to God. And God is really a very, very powerful being. In fact, he's omnipotent. He's omnipotent, he's omniscient, and he's also benevolent. So in Christian theology, you have one God, he's all-powerful, he's all-seeing, and he's kind and merciful. This leads to the central problem of all Christian theology called the problem of evil. That is, if God is all these things, why do human beings suffer? If God's omnipotent, why does he ever allow a child to die? Why does he ever allow an accident? So now, there are many answers to this. Most of Christian theology has been devoted to dealing with the problem of evil. John Milton wrote an epic poem, Paradise Lost, to deal with the problem of evil, and I don't want to deny that there have been many theological efforts to explain how you could have an omnipotent, omniscient, benevolent, single God and still have awful things happen, particularly to innocent people. Now, I don't think enough is sufficiently said in favor of pagan theology in the modern world. And let me say something on behalf of pagan theology. It has no problem with the problem of evil. For one thing, you no longer have one God. You have many gods, and they're often at cross purposes. And so we human beings may get caught in the crossfire between different gods. Moreover, the pagan gods are not omniscient and they're not omnipotent. They may be very strong, but they're never portrayed as omnipotent. That is, as being all-powerful, being able to do anything they can do. There are things they can't do. Zeus in the Iliad can't save his son Sarpedon, for example, as much as he might want to. Moreover, it's not so clear that the pagan gods are benevolent. They may, in fact, be malevolent. They sometimes have it in for human beings. Homer suggests that they particularly have it in for human beings who resemble them. So that, for example, Aphrodite has a real problem with Helen. Helen's too beautiful, almost more beautiful than Aphrodite. This comes up a lot in Greek mythology. And in any case, the gods in pagan mythology are capricious. They're willful, they do crazy things, and sometimes they just make mistakes. And it occurred to me when I started to notice how similar Oberon and Titania are to Zeus and Hera, that in effect Shakespeare offers a kind of rustic, anglicized pagan mythology here. By the way, what I have in mind is that Oberon and Titania quarrel the way Zeus and Hera do, and they argue over individual humans and which one gets the love of that human or who supports them. I mean, it really is quite remarkable how similar it is. And in general, what you see here with these fairies, and particularly Oberon and Titania, is they're not really malicious. They really don't have it in for human beings. In fact, it's stressed that they're pretty much good spirits. This is on page 54. This is Act 3, Scene 2, where Puck is getting nervous because the night is ending and all the evil spirits are coming out. So this is Act 3, Scene 2, about line 380. For night swift dragons cut the clouds full fast, and yonder shines Aurora's harbinger, at whose approach ghosts, wandering here and there, troop home to churchyards. Damned spirits all, that in crossways and floods have burial, already to their wormy beds are gone, for fear lest they should look their shames upon. They willfully themselves exile from light, and must for aye consort with black-browed night. And Oberon says, but we are spirits of another sort. I, with the morning's love, have oft made sport. We are spirits of another sort. We're not devils. We're not demonic. And I think that's very important to see that. And yet they mess with human beings. What we learn is they sometimes just have fun. The churned butter doesn't come out. That's the kind of thing that Puck explains. And in general, they make mistakes. Puck didn't mean to cause all this trouble. He meant to put the love juice on Demetrius's eye, but how could he tell Demetrius from Lysander? He was told, just look for an Athenian man, so he found an Athenian man and put the love juice on his eye. Now again, that wasn't malice. That was just a mistake. And in general, we see here a nature that ends up disordered because there are quarrels between Oberon and Titania and so on. Look at page 20. This is Act 2, Scene 1, about line 87. Here, Shakespeare correlates the quarrel between Titania and Oberon with a disruption in nature. Therefore the winds, piping to us in vain, as in revenge, have sucked up from the sea contagious fogs, which falling in the land hath every pelting river made so proud that they have overborne their continents. The ox therefore stretched his yoke in vain, the plowman lost his sweat, and the green corn hath rotted ere his youth attained a beard. Now, scholar, I believe it's Howard Jenkins, argues that these lines are related to Seneca's Oedipus, that they are derived from the description of the plague at the beginning of Oedipus by Seneca. Now, this is much disputed. It would be very interesting if it was. It would help suggest that Senecan background to the play I've been talking about. But even independent of that, you see here the sense of disruption in nature caused by these semi-divine beings. And again, it's not that they really have it in for human beings, but Oberon and Titania can get so angry that they forget about making nature run properly. But look what's at the heart of this. Over on page 21, so still Act 2, Scene 1, line 104. Therefore the moon, the governess of floods, pale in her anger washes all the air, that rheumatic diseases do abound, and through this temperature we see the seasons alter. I want you to see that the fundamental fact of the disruption of nature is the seasons altering. Line 111, the spring, the summer, the childing autumn, angry in winter, change their wonted liveries, and the mazed world by the increase now knows not which is which. Now, we talked about this as the central confusion among the human beings in the play. At the heart of the play is this thing that René Girard calls the sacrificial crisis, where the human beings have become indistinguishable. You can't tell Hermia from Helena or Lysander from Demetrius, and all hell breaks loose because people don't know their place anymore. Well, this is now true of all of nature. Now knows not which is which, and this same progeny of evils comes from our debate, from our dissension. We are their parents and original. very interesting here that the seasons should be the phenomenon, because it does suggest that if there's disorder in nature, the only reason is that there's an underlying order. That is, in a way, the premise of this vision of the disorderliness of nature is that normally nature is ordered. Now, you might notice that this is a very much a farmer's view of nature. That is, the central natural facts here are the weather and the crops. That when something goes wrong, it's with farming. The ox has therefore stretched his yoke in vain, the plowman lost his sweat, and the green corn hath rotted ere his youth attained a beard. Now this is hard for us to understand, we who think crops are grown in supermarkets. They are in fact grown on land. And for the majority of human history and for the majority of human beings, they lived the life of farmers. Again, this is inconceivable. I think it's something like 2 or 3% of the American population produces enough food, not just for the whole United States, but for much of the world. But for the majority of human history, most people spent their lives raising the food they needed to eat. And their perception of nature was completely related to their agricultural life. And the fundamental facts were the seasons. When is it time to sow? When is it time to reap? When is it time to harvest? I don't even know what these words mean, but I've seen them in poetry. When is the spring coming? When's the summer coming? When's winter coming? When's winter ever going to end? Even we sophisticated dwellers in Boston and Cambridge, are subject to the power of winter. And again, I would just like to stress how much more powerful nature was for most human beings in the age before technology. And so what we see here is, in a way, the ordinary human being's view of nature, which is a pagan view of nature. I think in some ways Shakespeare understood that the farmers of Athens were very similar to the farmers of England. In a way, I finally uncovered here why the play is set in Athens. I don't think it's an attempt to portray the historical Athens, but it is in some ways an attempt to get back in touch with paganism in Athens and the legendary world of Theseus. And the way to do that is to link up with the fact that, as different as Athens may be politically from England, the Athenians and the English confront the same world of nature when they confront the problem of agriculture. And here we see that, now here's why Oberon and Titania are a good portrait of the forces of nature. Because nature is basically benevolent, or we wouldn't be here. Basically, the seasons turn around, and summer may be delayed, but it gets there and the crops ripen. Winter is going to come. It may come early, but maybe we may have to rush to do the harvest. But basically, there's an overall rhythm of nature, and that underlies our perception of the disruptions of it. Why would we be standing around today saying, when will spring arrive, if we didn't have confident expectations that spring will arrive, because it's arrived for the past 20,000 years in human history. Again, it shows something about nature that in this play, it's basically in harmony with human interests. As people say, we live on the Goldilocks planet. We're not so close to the sun that it's too warm for us to exist. We're not so far from the sun that it's too cold for us to exist. When we say we live on the Goldilocks planet, we're really saying that nature, insofar as human beings perceive it, is basically benevolent, but not perfectly so. And that's, as I said, with a Christian conception of deity, Christian theology, you really do have to struggle with the question of why things ever go wrong, and the question of why aren't we in Eden when crops just grew without our having to do anything about them. By the way, the whole book of Genesis is a reflection on this problem in human existence. Why do we have to live by the sweat of our brows? But this pagan view is that nature is by and large regular and benevolent, but it's not perfectly so. And by the way, this is Aristotle's view of nature. Plato is something a little more complicated, but insofar as Aristotle's a Greek, and his thinking ultimately traces back to Homer and grows out of that set of ideas, you can say Aristotle is famous for being a teleological thinker, for believing in teleology. That is, nature aims at things. Nature is growth. It's things developing and growing. Indeed, the Greek word for nature, physis, comes from a Greek word for plant. And basically, for the Greeks, nature is something that grows on its own. And in Aristotle, yes, nature aims at things, but it doesn't always accomplish its aims. It doesn't try to create imperfect things, but sometimes it fails. It makes mistakes. Nature makes mistakes. Those blots of nature that Oberon mentions, this is back on page 85, Act 5, Scene 1, line 410, ever true and loving, and the blots of nature's hand shall not in their issue stand. Even in blessing these young lovers, Oberon reminds us that, yeah, occasionally nature makes mistakes, blots of nature. And again, that's what distinguishes Aristotelian teleology from Thomas Aquinas and Christian teleology, where nature must be perfect because it is under the control of a perfect God. Now, again, I realize this is highly speculative, but I'm suggesting that Shakespeare is shaping a kind of poetic view of nature that explains why it is the way it is. I don't think that Shakespeare literally believed that Oberon and Titania ruled the world. But if they did, if beings like that ruled the world, it would end up looking the way it does. So that it's not horrible. The world's not run by devils who are out to get us, to starve us by making crops fail all the time. By and large, crops work. And you plant stuff and you can reap it. And you do get enough to eat. Now, sometimes things go wrong. Bad weather. And the farmers are notoriously superstitious. They believe in weather prophets. If you ever want to understand farming and not farm, read Thomas Hardy's novels, Tess of the D'Urbervilles and the Mayor of Casterbridge, and then you'll see what I'm talking about here. I did not personally grow up in a farm. I grew up in Brooklyn, so about as remote from farms as you can get. But what I'm saying is, this play is the theology of a farm. It presents the theology of a farmer. What the forces behind nature must be like for things to work out as they do, which is, again, basically the world is sound and it's in harmony with our interests, but not always. And we see here with Oberon and Titania and Puck, sometimes Oberon and Titania are at cross purposes and they fight over an individual human being. Sometimes they're just not paying attention because they're quarreling with each other. Sometimes they are just puckish. You could say, if you were trying to imagine the spirit behind nature, I think it would be fair to say it's something not malicious, but capricious. And that's Puck for you. Not malicious, but capricious. Oh Lord, what fools these mortals be. These fairies do not identify with human beings. They are a different species, if you will. Yet they're fairly well disposed towards them. Oberon wants to straighten things out. And again, they just make mistakes sometimes. Nature makes mistakes. That's Aristotle, that's pagan mythology, that's Shakespeare here. So again, I offer this very tentatively. In fact, just thought of it a couple of weeks ago. But I think that suggests what Shakespeare is doing here, shaping a view of nature here. What would the forces behind nature have to look like it for it to be the way it is, which is not perfect, but also not completely imperfect. And again, every time we begin to think the world's completely disordered, as this winter, for example, you realize spring is sort of coming. It may be here today. Snow showers predicted for Saturday. But basically, I often wonder what it would be like to live in the red spot of Jupiter. I was just amazed when I learned that was just a gigantic hurricane that's lasted for hundreds of years, that it's a cyclonic storm in Jupiter's atmosphere. Just imagine if you lived in the red spot of Jupiter, what your view of nature would be. That is utterly chaotic. And try farming in the red spot of Jupiter. We don't live in a world like the red spot of Jupiter. For us, a hurricane or a cyclone or a tornado, that's an unusual event. On Jupiter, the weather reports, red spot again tomorrow, and every night, the damn red spot, and they'd have no idea that there's anything. That's why we didn't know it was a storm for hundreds of years. Galileo sort of didn't think that's a storm, because it seemed like a permanent feature. Anyway, our Goldilocks planet, that's what we live on. It's not perfect, but it's not as bad as Jupiter or Venus or whatever. Mars close, but I still wouldn't move there. Anyway, I offer you that thesis about the play, and it would suggest that Shakespeare is more philosophical. And I love the fact that it makes the Midsummer Night's Dream perhaps the most philosophical of his plays, when most people think it's a trifle. Now, I will somewhat support this by turning to Theseus's famous speech at the beginning of Act 5, the one about the lunatic, the lover, and the poet. Because it also dawned on me recently that this is Plato's critique of poetry in Book 10 of the Republic. And that makes it very interesting. And another reason why this play may be set in Athens, to refer us to Homer, the Homeric view of the gods, and to Plato's critique of it. This is a very famous speech. It's on page 70, Act 5, Scene 1. I never may believe these antique fables nor these fairy toys. Lovers and madmen have such seething brains, such shaping fantasies that apprehend more than cool reason ever comprehends. Now, it's very Platonic in the sense that it's a defense of cool reason, as the Republic is, where in the person of the philosopher king, reason is supposed to rule the best city. The lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact. One sees more devils than vast hell can hold. That is the madman. The lover, all is frantic, sees Helen's beauty in a brow of Egypt. The poet's eye, in a fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and as the imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Such tricks has strong imagination, that if it would but apprehend some joy, it comprehends some bringer of that joy, or the night imagining some fear, how easy is a bush supposed a bear. Now, it's very tempting to take a speech like this as Shakespeare's own opinion. We'll see this with the All the World's a Stage speech and As You Like It next week. That is, when Shakespeare writes one of these great poetic speeches and it's so quotable and you want to memorize it, you feel like saying, okay, this is Shakespeare speaking. I would like to say that to some extent it may be, but the truth of this speech is somewhat limited. It reflects that rationalism that I've said is a defect of Theseus. That is, he's come through all this play still with his faith in cool reason and an insufficient appreciation of the power of Eros, which may lead to a disaster in his marriage, as I've suggested. That is, this is still that sense that I'm rational and I'm above all these passions, and these passions are merely a subject of poetry here. Now, it is very Platonic. It's very close to Plato's critique of poetry in the Republic, which is fundamentally a critique of drama and criticizes drama for two basic reasons: that the audience takes the events for real. A great deal of discussion in the Republic about the mimetic character drama, how it imitates life and how people mistake the illusion for reality. This is a form of criticism to this day when people say it's now with video games. Kids playing video games can't tell the difference between video game violence and real violence, and if they play video games, they'll go out and kill people. This was said about television. It was said about movies. Plato said it about drama in the 5th century. Again, the standard critique of every form of representation has been that people confuse the representation with reality, something that we see happens in the staging of the Pyramus and Thisbe play. And moreover, Plato's other critique is that drama inflames the passions. And so he actually sees the lunatic, the lover, and the poet in cahoots here. Lovers see Helen's beauty in the brow of Egypt, that the lunatic, the lover, and the poet are swept away by passion. Indeed, the idea is that love and poetry are forms of lunacy, that people are just crazy, made crazy by such representations, that poetry appeals to the passions. And it makes people fall in love with tyranny, for example, as Plato suggests in the Republic. Now, in many ways, this play supports that understanding of poetry, and I cannot believe that Shakespeare wasn't aware of Plato's critique of poetry in the Republic. He may not have read the Republic, but all that had to happen was for Ben Jonson to sit down and explain it to him. And we see in this play, in Bottom, he's very much like the character at the end of the Republic who's given a chance to choose a new soul and chooses the soul of a tyrant. That famous moment in Book 10 of the Republic. And here, in effect, Bottom, given the chance to choose a part, chooses a tyrant, a lover or a tyrant, either one. Plato had a real sense, and Shakespeare has a real sense, that what drama appeals to is our passions. That's why we go to plays. We don't go to a play to see somebody up on the stage thinking rationally. We'll see in The Tempest what Shakespeare had to do to make that possible. But in these plays, in comedy or tragedy, we're looking at passionate characters. And Plato's complaint was that arouses the passions. And that seems to be Theseus's complaint too. But he takes it a little further here. And I'm going to press this, but I think the idea is the real problem with the poets here is that they give us our vision of the gods here. This is line 12 on page 70. The poet's eye in a fine frenzy rolling to glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. The poets are glancing at heaven, and they give us our idea of heaven. As imagination volleys forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Now, famously, people have seen this is what Shakespeare does in the play, gives names to airy nothings like Puck and Oberon Titania. But the ultimate airy nothings might be the gods, particularly the pagan gods. What do poets like Ovid do, or poets like Homer? Take the forms of things unknown and turn them to shapes and give to airy nothing a local habitation and name. Jupiter, Jove, Aphrodite, Mars, Apollo. These are all airy nothings given a local habitation and name. Such tricks have strong imagination that if it would apprehend some joy, it comprehends some bringer of that joy. That's amazingly applicable to the gods. That you get some blessing in life, something wonderful happens, you attribute it to a god. And similarly, or in the night, imagining some fear, how easy is a bush, suppose a bear. The fundamental example of this would be attributing the good things in nature to gods or the bad things. Look back on page 42. So Act 3, Scene 2, line 26. This is Puck talking about the humans. Their sense thus weak, lost with their fears thus strong, make senseless things begin to do them wrong. What this is talking about is the overwhelming human propensity to personify the forces of nature. When something good happens, to say a good being caused it, some good divine being. When something bad happens, to say some evil demonic being caused it. As an analysis of imagination, this is fundamentally an analysis of the mythic imagination, and we could say the theological imagination. Where do we get our ideas of the gods? Now, this is a central theme in Plato's Republic, where the critique of poetry in many ways is a critique of Homer. You see it already in Book 4 and culminating in Book 10. I think, I think Shakespeare's thinking through that, and this play tells us a lot about how human beings get their ideas of the gods. And again, that's my whole point about Oberon and Titania was, how could Shakespeare personify a capricious nature? If you didn't think there were real personal forces behind nature, you might still, for poetic reasons, personify them to create the image again of a nature that is not malicious but capricious. Therefore, what Shakespeare is doing in this play is what he says a poet, what Theseus says a poet does, namely to take airy nothings and give them a local habitation name. How could you take the complex and in some ways ungraspable order of nature and give a personified image of it that would explain the way it basically looks to us? Again, basically ordered, but with elements of disorder or caprice in it. Now, what I'm saying, again, I see in that speech a reflection of Plato's critique of poetry, and in that sense, Shakespeare's giving an answer to it here, that this play is Shakespeare's apology for poetry. When Socrates, in Book 10 of the Republic, talks about expelling the poets from the best city, he does leave an option. He says if they can give an apologia, an apology, an explanation, we'll let them back in if they can explain why I'm wrong about them. And Sir Philip Sidney had written an apology for poetry in the 1680s that Shakespeare undoubtedly knew of. And I think this play is Shakespeare's apology for poetry, that he's showing that particularly in this kind of Shakespearean comedy, drama would not do the wrong things that Plato says drama does. That in this play, Shakespeare makes fun of passion. He shows its limits. In effect, it is a moderating view of the passions. We see the lovers learn that their passions do get out of control. I often compare the play to an old TV show called Fantasy Island. Does anybody remember Fantasy Island? The plane boss, the plane? Oh, Ricardo Montalban, how soon they forget. Anyway, this was a show where this guy, Mr. Rourke, owned this island, and he would bring people to the island to act out their fantasies. You paid him a lot of money, and you would get to live out your fantasy on this island. So often it was like some plumber from Kansas always wanted to be an oil sheik. So he comes to the island, suddenly he's got a big palace and spend money on anything. And then he learns it's not all it was cracked up to be. People are out to assassinate him. I'm kind of making this up because it's been a long time since I've watched these shows, but this is the kind of plot they would have. And then there'd be this assassination plot, and it all turned on a pipe bomb, and the plumber had to turn back to his old plumbing talents to save his life, and learned that oil sheiks get assassinated because they don't know plumbing, but the plumber from Kansas could keep himself safe, and then he wants to go back to Kansas and be the plumber. That was kind of the way Fantasy Island worked. You got your fantasy, but it was always beware of what you wish for, because if you got it, you wouldn't want it. Well, the lovers in this play, they wanted the perfect love, the perfect dreamlike love, the totally subjective love, with none of the city involved, and no parents, and no Athenian law. And then they suddenly realized that was chaos. that they couldn't live with it, and they want to go back to the city. That's the way in which this play is a sobering play about passion. And then we have the incredible Pyramus and Thisbe interlude here, where Shakespeare shows us he can write a really, really bad play. It's one thing if you're Shakespeare to write a good play. He could do that in his sleep. But he shows us here he can write a really bad play. And it's a play that will not have the effect that bad plays do for Shakespeare, for Plato, because it's a play where we're not disposed to take illusion for reality. Now, Shakespeare admits Plato's critique that these ordinary people are disposed to take illusion for reality. They are constantly confusing the real world with the world of the play, so that when they're saying, well, how are we going to represent moonlight? And they check the calendar, oh, the moon's out that night, we'll have the moonlight shine in. And someone says, no, they can't do that. We'll just have a character come in, mark moonlight. And then this business where they're afraid the lion. We can't have a lion in our play in front of the ladies because the ladies will be scared. And so why they say, well, I have a prologue explain it's not a real lion. See, it's very Platonic in that sense. It's aware of that fact that audiences are disposed to take illusion for reality. But Shakespeare shows that ultimately audiences can tell illusion from reality, especially with a kind of play that is so bad. And Shakespeare does everything he can to show how bad it is. Page 75, for example, Act 5, Scene 1, we see overdoing of certain poetic techniques, alliteration, when words begin with the same sound, very popular in Shakespeare's day, but here, Act 5, Scene 1, line 145. Whereat with bloody, blameful blade, he bravely broached his boiling bloody breast. Let's get a little bit far there. Or then, my favorite lines, page 76, Act 5, Scene 1, about line 169. O grim-looked night, O night with you so black, O night whichever art when day is not. That's such a bad line. O night, whichever art, when day is not. O night, alack, alack, I fear my Thisbe's promise, alack. By the way, there are moments in Romeo and Juliet when it verges on that. If you can look it up, it's on page 102, Act 4, Scene 5, line 49. The nurse says, when they hear about Tybalt's death, oh woe, oh woeful, woeful, woeful day, most lamentable day, most woeful day that ever I did yet behold. Oh day, oh day, oh day, oh hateful day, never was seen so black a day as this. Oh woeful day, oh woeful day. Shakespeare is really pushing the envelope here, but I think it's a little in-joke between the two plays that he can work some of this really bad poetry into Romeo and Juliet and still make it work. And then, of course, these moments when Bottom breaks the stage illusion. This is Act 5, Scene 1, about line 183, when Theseus comments, the wall methinks being sensible should curse again. No, in truth, sir, he should not. Deceiving me is Thisbe's cue. She is to enter now, and I am to spy her through the wall. You shall see it will fall, Pala, as I told you. Yonder she comes. One thing Shakespeare does here is to break the wall of illusion between the audience and the play world, and that's one of the ways he creates detachment in the play as a whole. In other words, Plato thought that drama was totally involving, that it overwhelmed the audience and only inflamed their passions. Shakespeare's suggesting that if you write a comedy, you create a perspective on the action that actually creates detachment. Remember, that was the feeling that the lovers felt. I referred you to this last time, page 66, Act 4, Scene 1, line 149, when Demetrius says, these things seem small and undistinguishable, like far-off mountains turned into clouds. The remarkable effect Shakespeare achieves here is actually cathartic. It's cathartic of passions. Now, Aristotle is famous for coming up with this theory of catharsis, and we associate it with tragedy. Aristotle had the answer to Plato. Plato said drama inflames the passions. Aristotle argues, no, it purges them. Cathartic is actually a medical term. Catharsis is actually a medical term, like purgative in Greek. And his idea was by representing the passions, we could get them out of our system. And it is very likely, now again, we associate catharsis with tragedy, because that's what we see Aristotle speak of. Many people have theorized if we had book 2, the one dealing with comedy, that Aristotle was going to talk about a comic catharsis as well. And I think we see it in this play, that there's a way in which comedy can purge the passions too. And again, all of this would be an answer to Plato. We have then a sense, Shakespeare's reflecting on drama. He has Theseus make the Platonic challenge to drama. And I think Shakespeare agrees with a lot of it, especially this idea that poetry is what creates the gods for us. But he also challenges it by showing, here, when a play is this bad, nobody is swept up by the passion. It produces the same effect on the audience. And it's very interesting, the words that Theseus uses of the drama, where this is page 78, line 5, Act 5, scene 1, about line 212, when Hippolytus says, quite legitimately, "This is the silliest stuff that ever I heard." And Theseus says, "The best in this kind are but shadows." That's very Platonic again. If you know about the parable of the cave in the Republic, and indeed the whole discussion of mimesis or representation in Book 10 is all about how drama offers an image of an image, that the things in the real world are images of the Platonic ideas, and drama is just an image of that image. But Theseus then says, "And the worst of no worse, if imagination amend them, it must be your imagination then and not theirs." I think the play is ultimately a tribute to the poetic and the dramatic imagination on Shakespeare's part, showing I can answer Plato. I can offer him this apology for poetry. I can write a kind of drama that will work to moderate the passions, not to inflame them. And again, one sign that Shakespeare can do what Plato doubted poets and players can do, is that he can do both comedy and tragedy. And again, that's what Socrates asserts at the end of Plato's Symposium, but with the sense that no Greek dramatist had done that yet. I think Shakespeare finally delivers here, especially in this pair of plays, a kind of drama that recognizes Plato's objections, which are in some ways political objections to poetry. Again, I want to keep stressing that Eros looks like a different matter, but it really is a political problem. It's what creates disorder in society. And here we see how if Eros can be directed towards marriage and ultimately towards the family and children, it can be controlled, it can be put in some kind of a productive relation to the city and not be destructive. It threatens to tear the city apart at the middle of the play, but by the end it's providing a new way of unifying it and to bring the people back together into Athens in a way that makes them happy and the city prosperous. I think that's it. I'm sorry I did not get to As You Like It today. We're not too far behind, though. We will start with As You Like It next time, and you can stop hauling your Midsummer Night Dreams and Romeo and Juliet around with you. I won't make extensive references to that. But a question?
Yeah, so you said that Shakespeare, through the role of the fairies, is showing that nature is, not malicious execution. So isn't Shakespeare then critiquing or attacking the idea that there's like the Christian idea that there's a divine order to the world?
The question is he thereby attacking the notion of the Christian idea? It may well be. In any case, he's trying to shape a view of the world for the average farmer in a way. That, it's a really, or you could say this is a kind of political theology. What kind of view of nature is compatible with the way nature appears to be and with the political community? It would be, if nature is entirely divine, then human beings can just be passive about it. There's nothing they need do about it. If nature is entirely demonic, then there's also nothing it can do about it because it's all stacked against us. I think Shakespeare is offering this as a kind of healthy understanding of nature, that it's basically working for us, but we have to work with it. And again, we have to plow the fields. This isn't Eden where everything's just given to us, but it's not a world in which plowing the fields will systematically be unrewarded. You can see the disadvantage of either. One, if the world were really Eden, why work? If the world were run by a devil, also why work? Because he's just going to take it away from you. I think Shakespeare has a sense that Oberon and Titania, that's basically the ordinary person's understanding of nature. That it's not out to get us, but it's also not capable of helping us all the time. And to this day, a farmer has this view of nature. That's why, again, I think Shakespeare thought he could go back to Athens for it and link it up with England. And in some ways, he was trying to remake the superstition, the actually existing superstition. Because all this stuff about churning butter and the seasons, that was all part of folklore. And I think he thought the fairy idea was a little bit too much if they were such malevolent or powerful beings. I think he hoped to shape this view. How, again, I'm offering this as the most speculative thing I've offered here. But I think it's interesting. All right. Good question.